Welcome to the White Collar Files, the podcast that delves into the shadowy world of financial crimes and corporate misdeeds. I'm your host, Ethan, and today we're exploring how white-collar crime stands apart from other forms of criminal activity. We'll uncover the unique characteristics that make these crimes so challenging to detect and prosecute, and why they often fly under the radar. Whether you're a business professional, a true crime enthusiast, or simply curious about the darker side of the corporate world, this episode will give you a new perspective on crime in the boardroom. So, let's dive in and discover what sets white-collar crime apart from the rest. Today, we're exploring how white-collar crime distinguishes itself from other forms of criminal activity. This is a crucial topic for understanding the unique challenges these crimes present to law enforcement, regulators, and society as a whole. Let's start with the basics. White-collar crime, as coined by sociologist Edwin Sutherland in 1939, refers to a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. This definition immediately sets white-collar crime apart from what we might consider traditional or street crime. One of the primary distinguishing factors of white-collar crime is its nonviolent nature. Unlike robbery, assault, or murder, white-collar crimes don't involve physical harm or the threat of violence. Instead, they're characterized by deceit, concealment, or violation of trust. This nonviolent aspect often leads to a perception that white-collar crimes are less serious than other offenses, a misconception we'll explore further in this episode. Another key distinction is the motivation behind white-collar crime. While many crimes are driven by a variety of factors including poverty, addiction, or passion, white-collar crimes are primarily motivated by financial gain. The perpetrators are often already wealthy or in positions of power, yet they seek to increase their wealth or maintain their status through illegal means. The profile of the typical white-collar criminal is also distinct from that of other offenders. White-collar criminals are often well-educated, successful professionals with no prior criminal history. They're typically middle-aged or older, and they occupy positions of trust and respectability in their communities. This profile contrasts sharply with the stereotypical image of a criminal, which can make white-collar offenders harder to identify and prosecute. The complexity of white-collar crimes is another distinguishing factor. Many white-collar schemes involve intricate financial transactions, manipulation of complex systems, or exploitation of legal loopholes. This complexity not only makes these crimes difficult to detect and investigate but also contributes to their ability to cause widespread harm. For example, a sophisticated securities fraud scheme might involve multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex financial instruments. Unraveling such a scheme requires specialized knowledge and resources that aren't typically needed for investigating other types of crime. The scope and impact of white-collar crime also set it apart. While a street crime might affect an individual or a small group, white-collar crimes can have far-reaching consequences that impact entire organizations, industries, or even national economies. The Enron scandal, for instance, led to the collapse of one of America's largest corporations, cost thousands of people their jobs and life savings, and shook public confidence in corporate governance and accounting practices. Another distinguishing feature of white-collar crime is its often long-term nature. Unlike a robbery or assault, which typically occur in a single instance, many white-collar crimes unfold over months or even years. This prolonged duration not only allows the crime to grow in scale but also makes it more difficult to trace and prosecute. The use of technology in white-collar crime is another distinguishing factor. While technology can be used in various types of criminal activity, it plays a particularly crucial role in many white-collar offenses. Cybercrime, for instance, is a rapidly growing category of white-collar crime that relies entirely on technology. From hacking and identity theft to complex online fraud schemes, these crimes require a level of technological sophistication that sets them apart from traditional offenses. The legal and regulatory landscape surrounding white-collar crime is also distinct. Many white-collar offenses are governed by complex regulatory frameworks and specialized laws that don't apply to other types of crime. For example, insider trading is regulated by securities laws, while tax evasion falls under tax law. This specialized legal environment requires prosecutors and investigators to have specific expertise that isn't necessary for handling other types of criminal cases. Another key distinction is the way white-collar crimes are often prosecuted. In many cases, white-collar offenses are handled through civil rather than criminal proceedings. This means that instead of facing jail time, offenders may be subject to fines, restitution, or other civil penalties. This approach is less common with other types of crime and reflects the unique nature of white-collar offenses. The role of corporate entities in white-collar crime is another distinguishing factor. While other forms of crime are typically committed by individuals acting alone or in small groups, white-collar crimes can involve entire organizations. The concept of corporate criminal liability, where a company itself can be held criminally responsible, is largely unique to white-collar crime. The diffuse nature of harm in white-collar crime also sets it apart. In many cases, it can be challenging to identify specific victims of white-collar crime. For example, in a case of securities fraud, the victims might be thousands of individual investors spread across the country or even the world. This diffusion of harm can make it more difficult to generate public outrage or sympathy for victims, which can impact how these crimes are perceived and prosecuted. The way white-collar crimes are detected and reported is another distinguishing feature. Many white-collar crimes come to light through internal audits, whistleblowers, or regulatory inspections rather than through traditional police work. This means that the process of uncovering these crimes often involves different mechanisms and players than those involved in detecting other types of criminal activity. The role of professional enablers is another unique aspect of white-collar crime. Many white-collar schemes rely on the assistance, knowingly or unknowingly, of lawyers, accountants, or other professionals who help facilitate or conceal the illegal activity. This involvement of seemingly legitimate professionals adds another layer of complexity that's less common in other forms of crime. The global nature of many white-collar crimes is another distinguishing factor. While other types of crime can certainly cross borders, white-collar offenses are particularly prone to international dimensions. Money laundering, for instance, often involves moving funds through multiple countries to obscure their origin. This international aspect not only increases the potential scale of these crimes but also complicates efforts to investigate and prosecute them. The impact of white-collar crime on trust in institutions is another unique feature. When corporate executives, government officials, or other respected professionals engage in criminal behavior, it can shake public confidence in the systems and organizations they represent. This erosion of trust can have far-reaching consequences that extend beyond the immediate impact of the crime itself. The potential for significant collateral consequences is another distinguishing characteristic of white-collar crime. Beyond legal penalties, those convicted of these offenses may face professional disbarment, loss of licenses, and significant difficulty finding future employment. These collateral consequences can be just as impactful as the formal legal penalties and are less common in other types of crime. The role of corporate culture in facilitating white-collar crime is another unique aspect. In some cases, a company's emphasis on short-term profits or a culture of win at all costs can create an environment that encourages or turns a blind eye to unethical or illegal behavior. This organizational aspect sets white-collar crime apart from many other types of offenses. The potential for systemic risk is another distinguishing feature of white-collar crime. In some cases, these offenses can pose a threat not just to individual companies or investors, but to entire economic systems. The 2008 financial crisis, which was partly fueled by fraudulent practices in the mortgage industry, is a stark example of how white-collar crime can have far-reaching, systemic impacts. The role of regulatory bodies in combating white-collar crime is another key distinction. Unlike street crimes, which are primarily dealt with by traditional law enforcement, white-collar offenses often involve specialized regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This regulatory aspect adds another dimension to how these crimes are detected, investigated, and prosecuted. The use of civil asset forfeiture in white-collar cases is another distinguishing factor. While asset forfeiture can be used in other types of crime, it plays a particularly prominent role in white-collar cases. The ability to seize assets believed to be derived from criminal activity, even before a conviction, is a powerful tool in the fight against white-collar crime that isn't as commonly used in other areas of law enforcement. The role of compliance programs in preventing white-collar crime is another unique aspect. Many companies invest heavily in internal controls and compliance measures to prevent and detect potential misconduct. This emphasis on self-policing and internal prevention is a distinctive feature of the white-collar crime landscape. The use of deferred prosecution agreements, DPAs, and non-prosecution agreements, NPAs, is another distinguishing characteristic of how white-collar crimes are handled. These agreements, which allow companies to avoid criminal charges in exchange for cooperation and remedial measures, are rarely used in other areas of criminal law. The potential for significant reputational damage is another unique aspect of white-collar crime. When a white-collar crime is uncovered, it often leads to substantial negative publicity for the individuals and organizations involved. This reputational risk can have long-lasting effects, impacting everything from stock prices to future business opportunities. The role of whistleblowers in exposing white-collar crime is another key distinction. While informants play a role in many types of criminal investigations, whistleblowers are particularly crucial in uncovering white-collar offenses. Many jurisdictions have specific laws protecting whistleblowers and even providing financial incentives for reporting certain types of corporate misconduct. The use of advanced analytics and artificial intelligence in detecting white-collar crime is another distinguishing feature. As these crimes become more sophisticated, so do the tools used to combat them. From machine learning algorithms that can detect anomalies in financial transactions to AI-powered systems that can analyze vast amounts of data for signs of fraud, technology plays a crucial role in the fight against white-collar crime. The potential for environmental harm is another aspect that sets some white-collar crimes apart. Environmental crimes, such as illegal dumping or violations of emissions standards, are often classified as white-collar offenses. These crimes can have long-lasting impacts on ecosystems and public health, distinguishing them from many other types of criminal activity. The role of corporate governance in preventing white-collar crime is another unique aspect. Strong governance practices, including independent boards and robust internal controls, are seen as key defenses against corporate misconduct. This emphasis on governance is less relevant to other types of crime. The potential for political influence is another distinguishing factor in white-collar crime cases. Given the often high-profile nature of the defendants and the significant resources at their disposal, there can be attempts to influence the political or regulatory process to avoid prosecution or minimize penalties. This level of potential political interference is less common in other types of criminal cases. The use of plea bargaining in white-collar cases often differs from its use in other criminal matters. In white-collar cases, plea bargains may involve not just reduced charges or sentences, but also agreements about regulatory compliance, corporate restructuring, or other business-related matters. This broader scope of negotiation is a unique feature of many white-collar crime resolutions. The role of expert witnesses in white-collar crime trials is another distinguishing factor. While expert testimony can be important in many types of cases, it plays a particularly crucial role in white-collar trials. Financial experts, forensic accountants, and industry specialists are often needed to explain complex transactions or business practices to the jury. The potential for class action lawsuits is another unique aspect of white-collar crime cases. When a company engages in fraud or other misconduct, it often leads to class action suits from shareholders or other affected parties. This civil litigation aspect, running parallel to criminal proceedings, is less common in other areas of criminal law. Finally, the evolving nature of white-collar crime itself is perhaps its most distinguishing characteristic. As our expert points out, as we look to the future, it's clear that white-collar crime will continue to evolve, presenting new challenges for law enforcement, regulators, and society as a whole. This constant evolution means that our understanding and approach to white-collar crime must continually adapt as well. In conclusion, white-collar crime distinguishes itself from other forms of criminal activity in numerous ways. From its non-violent nature and complex methods to its far-reaching impacts and unique legal challenges, white-collar crime presents a distinct set of issues for society to grapple with. Understanding these distinguishing factors is crucial for developing effective strategies to prevent, detect, and combat these sophisticated offenses. As we've seen, white-collar crime is not just another category of illegal activity. It's a complex, evolving phenomenon that reflects and exploits the intricacies of our modern financial and corporate systems. By recognizing what sets white-collar crime apart, we can better appreciate the unique challenges it presents and the specialized approaches needed to address it. That brings us to the end of today's episode of the White Collar Files. I hope this exploration of how white-collar crime distinguishes itself from other forms of criminal activity has been as enlightening for you as it has been for me. If you found this episode informative, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Your support helps us continue to shed light on these important issues and bring you in-depth analyses of the world of white-collar crime. Join us next time as we delve into another fascinating aspect of financial misconduct. Until then, stay vigilant and keep questioning.